Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I am so excited to invite my dear friend and a prolific thinker and author, Shefaly Yogendra, to this podcast on leadership at the edge of AI. Shefaly, for our listeners and viewers, can you give a very, zappy kind of shortcut along your career trajectory, please?
So I am a portfolio non-executive director. Over the last decade, I have worked in a range of boardrooms, mostly in regulated sectors, but critically in both owner-led and professional manager-led organizations. The sectors I worked in include financial services, energy, tech, and higher education. In terms of the long arc of technology that I'm familiar with, I am an electronics and comms engineer. And at the same time, my last exec role was in a startup in the symbolic AI space, and we were building explainable AI for regulated industries. From the board's point of view, I brought my experience as well as interviews done with about 100 board directors globally in the form of a book to the world recently. And the book's called Uncharted Spaces, Reset the Agenda, Reimagine the Boardroom, where in addition to boardroom dynamics, I have gone into details of some developments in technology, in geopolitics, and in climate action, which are essentially changing what the boards should do, what they should talk about, and whom they should talk about all of that stuff with, which means resetting the agenda and reimagining the boardroom. My perspective remains shaped by engineering, management, technology policy, and I have a PhD in decision making, which really helps me both examine my own decision making models and that of others around me. And that really helps because decision making is a practice sport, just like governance. So we get better the more reflection we do on how we are conducting our job in boardrooms and how we are making decisions.
Yeah, I mean, and indeed, and thank you for that. You've sat on so many different boards, many different sectors through. I read through, your work in the book, and we'll speak more about the book in financial services, technology, higher education. When in your mind did AI arrive as a board agenda topic powerfully that it actually reset the way the board works and governance works?
I think there are twofold things in there. One is you're asking about when it arrived. So when the idea of generative AI burst onto people's consciences, that's when most people started thinking about AI. In reality, if you think about it, predictive AI tools have been in use in many, many aspects of businesses already. Predictive AI, based on patterns that we can recognize, was already being used for fraud detection for a very long time, in marketing demand prediction. So those tools were already there. What really happened is that the hype machine with generative AI got the interest of absolutely everybody. And what it has done, and I'm not referring, and I'm particularly not going to talk about my boards because that's not the done thing, but I do work with a lot of CEOs, CFOs, and CTOs, having conversations and actually examining what their decision-making model is, given this transformational technology is now available. One of the observations that I made is that while it is supposed to be an enterprise tech, it got the attention of individuals as users first. Now, the last time this happened was when social platforms came about. And I recall that in 2008, I was due to give a speech somewhere, and eventually I did write it up, which was that social media companies were not going to make any money until the enterprise engaged with them. So this is similar but different in that the impact of social media platforms was additive to the business. In the sense you could say, well, we have all these channels for customer support. Maybe one channel could be Twitter, right?
Yeah.
Or you could say we are doing some social listening. Our corporate PR already targets and tracks what people are talking about when they talk about our company. But now we could have social listening tools and see what the brand perception is. Are people talking about us in negative light, positive light? What are they discussing, and so on and so forth. So it was kind of additive to the tools that were already being used. The possibilities of generative AI are transformational, as I said earlier, because they give you the chance, if you wanted to take it, to look at what would you do to design this organization if you had a blank sheet of paper, because that then gives you an idea of the fluff that is already there in organizations, but also the possibilities that you don't address because you don't have executive bandwidth and you don't have time, because the fluff is taking away a lot of your time. And those two things do coexist and can coexist. And therefore, what changed in the room was, because the consumer end started first, the first thing that a lot of savvy organizations who were alert to the risks that can create did was that they set up a policy with guardrails. Because if people start using your organization's proprietary data and confidential information and sticking them in their free tools that were available online, then they're already creating risk surfaces that the board doesn't probably know how to kind of countenance the scope of and the challenges that might arise from it, right? So that was one of the first things that changed in the room, that people noticed that because individuals have begun to use it, organizations haven't yet have a policy. The smart organizations that I encountered in the early days of ChatGPT bursting onto people's, awareness, was guardrails were put very quickly that you are not going to use it on organizational computers and on using organizational data. Now, how well those policies actually serve to contain those behaviors is a whole different conversation.
Yes, and again, as you said, ChatGPT. So November 22 is when we are now 3.5 years in, and yet personally, I have felt that the last 6 months there is like again a quantum leap in terms of, I would say, not maybe the general public, but still anybody, a savvy individual in an organization who has a relative interest in technology and updates. I think they now have fairly powerful tools, that are at their disposal. And I'm just wondering, what about the board? I mean, in the book, Uncharted Spaces, you argue that the boards need to be more braver and more imaginative, right? What does that mean? And could you walk us through an example of a board, who has actually fulfilled that role and how that impacted executive functioning, maybe the CEO and their team, but maybe the organization as a whole?
So I would point you to a few different things. A couple of weeks ago, there was a survey that came out in the US which said 90% of the boards thought AI was the responsibility of the C-suite. And when the same question was put to the C-suite members, they pointed in 4 or 5 different directions, including into functions. So this is actually a rupture that is going to be quite challenging to overcome, because we are talking about accountability. And the two words that I have used are braver and imaginative. The imaginative part refers to what I was saying earlier, that if you had a blank sheet of paper and you had to redesign this organization in the broader context that exists for your business, how would you do it? But braver so that you can have the conversations that are necessary with the people who are going to be affected, and not always affected in the way that they will lose their job and they will not have a source of income, but in terms of actually having to change their role, their engagement with the younger generations who are the source of talent for senior generations or seniority in the organization, how they will actually crystallize what they know. Because a lot of us who have a lot of experience carry around a ton of information in our heads about how we do our jobs. And if you look at what automation requires, is that it requires you to break down your job, not just into tasks, but also the connectivity between tasks. And therefore, what tasks are automatable and what tasks are not automatable. And if you automate this task, how does that affect all the other things it is connected to? So it does require people to bring something which I also reference in the book, metacognitive reflection on their job. They must understand not just what they do, but what exactly are the steps that they take. So when you look at all of those things, to understand this and to demand this of senior leaders, whom the board thinks should be accountable for all of this, or wants to hold accountable for all of this, to ask them to do this work is both an act of bravery and an act of imagination. And knowing that the CEOs and their teams are dealing with a whole lot of other volatility, such as geopolitics and challenges of war, and a board that is discussing imagination also has to stretch their imagination to the possibility of the scarcity of fuel and food, without which all the imagination might need to wait a little bit in the backseat.
True that, true that. The other thing I have noticed, Shefali, and again, I don't know if you have seen that in your work. I work with a couple of CEOs who would like to have more AI savviness, not in the entire board membership, but at least in a couple of them. And that's not necessarily the case across the boards. I'm wondering, do you know of board members who are really keeping themselves up to speed? How does one even do that, right? I mean, I recently saw the appointment of a senior pharmaceutical leader on the board of a popular AI organization, and in that direction, like, and you could argue that one is like an application based usage, and then there is pure technology. But I wonder, how do boards reinvent themselves? Because the speed at which all of this is changing is extraordinary. Yet that intersection of how do you apply what technology can now offer and make it, like you mentioned, contextually very relevant, and does not become an exercise in just having the latest technology and the latest tools, which is also the danger. What would your recommendation be? Because I feel just like there is a lot of discomfort in the people whose jobs may be impacted, whose sources may be impacted. There's also a lot of discomfort around like almost reinventing yourself and recreating an identity at all levels in the organization.
So it's an interesting question to say that CEOs and the exec teams want more AI savvy board directors. What do they mean? Do they mean people who can use these tools? Do they mean people who can keep up with how rapidly the models are changing and you're trying to undertake or govern or hold accountable or direct an exercise in transformation using generative AI? Or do they mean people who can actually help reinvent the entire organization's processes, as some organizations are now doing, that they're linking people's incentives to how much AI tools they use? None of these is adequate in itself. But to say that an AI savvy board director is required is to demand rather a lot without being specific about it. And to your point that people are having to keep up on top of a lot of stuff, it definitely is the case. And this is just one of the moving pieces in the grand scheme of things. So essentially, a lot is being demanded. And this is why my viewpoint is that the upkeep of one's own knowledge and the intellectual honesty needed to question one's own priors, asking multiple ways the questions, how am I right and how could I be wrong? And doing that on a continual basis actually demands a lot of board directors right now. Now, if you look at the time commitment required to do all of this, there are two ways to do it. You can either be the kind of person who's actually just reading quite a lot, talking to a lot of people, and so on. And the other is to periodically hold things like masterclasses on certain topics. Now, when a topic or a particular aspect of the topic is moving really rapidly, how do you even determine whether the masterclass is relevant to hold today and will be relevant tomorrow, right? So essentially, to your question about having to reimagine one's own identity is critical. And those who are not curious, fundamentally curious, and fundamentally pursuing the developments themselves actively, they are the people who will probably going to find it difficult. Those who are curious and are pursuing things, they will probably find themselves unfit in other ways. They might actually know certain things ahead of the conversations that are happening in the board, and that also doesn't help. So on either
Exactly.
side, there
Exactly.
is a lot of demand, essentially.
Yeah.
But first, we have to ask the question, what does AI savvy mean?
Mm. And again, AI savvy and the needs of the organization, so the executive committee, and like you mentioned, there is a discrepancy even there around whose final accountability and responsibility it should be. But some of those qualities that we speak about, curiosity, learning agility, ability to, unlearn and relearn, I mean, those are not new. It's just that the pace that, the change is taking place at this moment, and very fundamental foundational changes, right? In the way the business model is structured, in the way how, what success looks like, that itself is getting questioned today, right? And I mean, the example that came to my mind, Shefali, is one of the CEOs I work with. He is himself very technically savvy, and when some of the latest tools came and they were available, not with enterprise level security, but were available, he had this dilemma, would he then be able to create enterprise level security to be able to use some of the proprietary data? And there was nobody really to stop him, right, in this case. um, or should he just wait till some of these tools then become and then are agreed on by the organization or signed off, by IT security or whatever? And I think that does become a challenge, because suddenly now there are, because skills are becoming, I think, less, I wouldn't say less relevant, they're becoming as relevant as context in today's world, right? I mean, I have personally explored a little bit, some of these generative AI models, and it's quite fascinating how to say, take the role of this person, bring these skills.md, file in there, and create that kind of, proposal or that kind of design. Personally, it would take me hours. And now the starting point, I still edit it because it doesn't have enough context, it doesn't have discernment and judgment. But the quality of the starting point, as compared to even a GPT a couple of years back, is dramatically different now, which means that there is no end to how much you can do, and the cost is reducing almost to zero, right? I mean, apart from your own time, of course. So that creates a discrepancy. And I wonder, I mean, in your point of view, did you have a time when you took some advice, Shefali, about, this whole topic of AI and leadership, that turned out to be either really good or really bad?
I think I haven't yet received any advice on AI from anybody. But if I go back to the beginning of your comment just now, you said that not knowing is a challenge. How do you learn? I think the key difference that has become very evident and hard to hide is that earlier you could faff around a lot of things and manage to fill the air with verbiage that made it look like you sort of kind of knew something. Sometimes in rapidly changing environments, it is safer to say, I don't know, than to say, I know, and then we found out that you don't. So that is really a challenge, because I'm in many, many conversations, I find people resorting to, especially online, ChatGPT says this. And I'm thinking, but you are 60 years old. I want to know what you think. Because the context window narrowing and finding the articulation of something in the words of a machine, which are perfectly formed and neater than the chaos that we might often have inside our own heads processing our own thoughts. That to me is actually terrifying, because the cognitive dumping that is happening and the cognitive outsourcing that is happening is not helpful to the judgment we need in navigating this conversation in organizations, right? So I haven't received any great advice, except from time to time, I see a lot of people saying agentic AI will change everything. This is going to destroy cybersecurity. That is going to change, and no more software engineers will be needed. Almost every single time, if you look at the source of these claims, you will find that they have a thing to peddle. So to that extent, I feel that the role of independent board directors is even more critical, because in a given boardroom, they are thinking about that organization without peddling anything else. in the
Yeah.
organization, right? They
Yeah.
are essentially thinking of their own statutory duty to ensure the long-term success of a business using everything they know, everything they can learn, everything they have experienced. And to that extent, they become a good, valuable asset to have in the boardroom in this conversation. And therefore, advice itself is so context specific that it may not transfer, which we know as a truism from early days of management practice too. The best practice doesn't travel. It is specific to that context.
Very, very true. And I mean, I'm reminded of this whole idea of Peter Senge's learning organization, an idea probably a couple of decades old. But it seems to me that it has become now critical in organizations. And what does that even mean?
Yes.
When you are a learning organization, what does that mean? We speak quite eloquently about the importance of failure for innovation, the importance of failing publicly, admitting all of that. But there people are currently also super scared about their own relevance, right? And again, at all levels, but probably leaders a bit more, especially if that was the leader, like you said, if they were the connecting tissue, or worse, they were the expert or the cleverest people in the room. That identity again is being questioned because there will be people with lesser experience who probably have done deep research and deep study and will come up with options that maybe the most experienced person in the room has not necessarily considered, which then puts everybody, I think, who is a part of that conversation in quite a confusing, I don't know if confusing is the right word, but quite a precarious situation. Have you come across any of those conversations or conversations that happened after those meetings that you would like to share?
So I think it's an interesting thing you mention about the most experienced person in the room actually no longer has to carry the can. And I feel that's liberating. One, because making somebody the fall guy or the boardroom whisperer was never the point. The responsibility is collective, the contribution may be individual. So, in a way, it is actually liberating for the person who has been carrying the can for topic X or topic Y in the boardroom. The second thing I would say is that the question of relevance has never been more relevant. And what does relevance mean? It just means that what you have, do you know what bits out of your experience, skills, knowledge, even the models, theoretical frameworks, and everything that we have collected over the years, which of them really applies here and which of them doesn't? But then again, to an earlier point you made about innovation and learning through that process, innovation has always happened on the edges of organizations. People who are deeply embedded in networks more closely see what the network does, but they don't always see what the other guys are doing. It's the people on the edges who turn around and ask another network, what are you doing? What are you working on? Right? So I think relevance is now not something which is static, it is dynamic. It is very easy to be found out if you don't know. And therefore, it is, all Christmases come for people who ask questions and are curious and pursue the answers to those questions. And at the same time, it reminds me of a kaleidoscope. You know, the pieces are static inside the kaleidoscope, but every pattern that gets made is different from the one that was made before. And I think essentially that has what become, that has what our jobs have become, that we need to think
That's such
widely.
a beautiful analogy, and I can almost visualize that. And it seems the speed at which the kaleidoscope is moving is increasing, right?
Yeah.
So even those patterns that are emerging, by the time you're making sense of it, it has moved on again.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, that's very beautiful. Um, what advice would you give maybe a board director who's struggling, to find their own relevance in this situation and maybe, had a different sort of expertise which is maybe not aligned with this whole idea of moving on. Maybe that expertise was built on years and years of institutional knowledge, or whatever else it might be, right? What is it that you would advise such a person, Shefali, to do? Especially, I love that metaphor with this changing kaleidoscope of what good looks like.
I would say in regulated industries, understanding where regulation came from, why it has the shape it has today, and where it might go, all those things remain important. And therefore, let's say there is a person who has a lot of experience in the regulated industry. If they wish, they don't have to become completely irrelevant. They still have the historic arc. They understand how the regulator's thinking works. They understand the principles underpinning the regulation. What they need is some imagination, given a lot of these shenanigans around us, including, let's say, technological change, is to try and project forward to see what the regulatory trajectories are and use their experience and their knowledge of the regulator, as well as other companies in their sector that are regulated by the same regulator or a different one, to try and examine what they could bring by way of scenarios to their boardroom. So they can find their own relevance, but they're going to have to do work. As I periodically have said in public and written now in the book, it's not a job that people do at the end of their executive careers to have an easy life of some kind. It is a full-time job on its own. And one of the tests would be that when you see a headline, let's say in the Financial Times or the Wall Street Journal, or even the Neue Zürcher Zeitung, how do you react? What are the thoughts in your head? Do you react with concern? Do you react with fear? Do you immediately think of the companies that you're working with, either as a board director or a CEO advisor or anything? And how is your brain really making those connections? That'll tell you how motivated you are and what you're motivated by. And if your first reaction is fear and despondency, then it is worth reflecting on whether this is something you should be doing, given all of this chaos.
True that. I mean, in the research for your book, I know you spoke to various people, you yourself have experience of diverse industries and personality types. What was one of the most surprising findings that you have put out now?
The role of the chair was at once a surprising and a non-surprising finding. Good chairs absolutely can make or break how a board really serves or fails to serve a company. And that was something which came through all the interviews. And the interviews are not even just related to the Western Hemisphere. The interviews feature board chairs and CEOs who have experience in multiple cultures and countries around the world. And the most effective chairs hold high standards. They behave to high standards. They pull up their boards to behave along with those standards or alongside, to those standards. And they actually foster a culture which encourages debate and disagreement rather than crushes it. So essentially, that is a really important thing as far as the role of boards in this rapid change is concerned. Good chairing will probably never go out of fashion.
Thank you. One of my favorite questions to end this conversation is, what is something you understand intellectually about AI and AI in the context of what we are speaking about, in the context of leadership, but cannot yet clearly see enough to take, let's say, some specific action on?
Action on in which context?
No, I'm just wondering if there is something that you understand enough, but not enough to take action to bring change, whatever that change might be, right? So an example of something that you spoke about, metacognition, right? So something might be that, yes, I understand this intellectually and I sort of get it, but to bring that about to a group of people, to a board, to an organization, is there a gap there? I'm just wondering if there are some of these things that you understand intellectually but cannot yet action, do whatever that action might be, right? It depends on what that thought or what that idea is.
I think one thing is very clear, that what an individual does in using a lot of these tools versus what an organization does are two completely different things. It's not the summation of individuals that make up an organization, but the organizational processes themselves are complicated, have tacit elements which are not codified, which nobody quite understands. And the example that I give of that is that when everybody was sent home at short notice during the first lockdowns in 2020, organizations kept functioning, which meant that whatever that tacit element was, it was able to function as well in the virtual world as it was in the physical world. In a similar way, there might be a parallel for how organizations can keep working, but there has to be an AI analog. So I think that's the thing I would say. I understand that intellectually, but it'll vary so much between the individual's adoption and an organization's adoption of generative AI kind of thinking in a transformational way that is very difficult to translate. And therefore, I am thinking about it. I do what I do, but I'm not sure that that actually still easily translates to an organizational context.
And to make that thought or that understanding implementable or have some specific repercussions because of that understanding, right?
Yeah, because as individuals we know what the repercussions might be, not always, but the idea of consequentiality was ingrained in me as a child. So I always think of consequences and second and third order consequences. As individuals, we have our own risk appetites, which may be very different from the risk appetites of the organizations that we are overseeing or that we are working in as execs. And if those two mismatch, it doesn't matter how much individual experience you accumulate, whether or not you can bring that to bear in the organizational context is a very different level of complexity and multifacetedness, as it were, that needs a very different level of thinking.
So true. Thank you, Shefaly. One last comment, insight that you would like to share before we close for today.
I would say it is important that we don't get devastated every day by the doom and gloom headlines, because it is important that we look ahead with optimism while being grounded in realism. Things that we don't control are where they are, but we have to look at what we can control. And we can't build our way out of a challenging set of situations by being pessimistic or dark or just sitting in a corner and crying.
Very well said. Thank you so much. As always, a delight to speak with you.
Thank you.
And I wish you a very good afternoon.